Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Wednesday, September 18th, 2024 meeting of the Tualatin City Planning Commission. Lindsay, will you call the roll, please?
Yes, Chair Beers,
Here.
Vice Chair Thompson, Commissioner Bali, and Commissioner Paracchini. Sorry about that. I'll get it.
Pericini.
Paracchini.
Yes. Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. Next on our agenda is announcements and Planning Commission communication. Do you have anything to communicate to staff, upcoming absences, anything like that?
I'll just note that we have our new planning commissioner, and so I didn't put it on the agenda, but historically we just give them an opportunity to introduce themselves and tell the rest of the commission a little bit about themselves. So,
Ready for do a little introduction? Now that you're on the spot.
I'm Alan Pericchini. My wife and I have lived here for about 3.5 years. I am not familiar in depth with the city yet. I'm still in the process of doing that. My background is and relationship to planning is primarily journalistic. I was a journalist for 35 years and in public relations for 20. So I've had that kind of exposure to the planning process. As you can imagine, sometimes involving very controversial issues, sometimes not. What I hope to accomplish by being on the commission is working to make the city as responsive as it can be to particularly needs like this transportation study, which I find fascinating. I am also very interested in housing issues and believe that housing is a primary objective of any community these days, particularly affordable housing, workforce housing, that kind of thing. So I hope to make some small contribution in that regard on the commission.
Thanks, Alan. Welcome. Let's see. We'll have to push the approval minutes to next time, so we have a quorum of the folks that were there for the minutes.
difficulties here. There we go. I think that's a wise decision.
Okay,
Thank you.
We'll postpone that. Lindsay, do we have anyone online or just us?
We do not. Just
Okay.
us.
I see we have some folks in the public. Would you like to communicate to the planning commission on anything that's not on the agenda?
No, I'm one of the land use officers from the Byron CIO,
Oh, excellent.
strictly here for observation.
Okay, great. Well, moving right along to our first agenda item first communication from city staff. Staff will present a brief update on the ongoing transportation system plan project. A draft of the TSP policies and constrained project lists are included as attachments.
Share my screen. Thank you, Chair Beers, Steve Cooper, Assistant Community Development Director. I'm joined here by Cody Field, Management Analyst 2, and we are here to give you a update on the transportation system plan process as it's been going, engagement summary, policies, and project list review. Take it away, Cody.
Thanks. Thanks for having me, commissioners. As Steve said, my name is Cody Field. I'm the management analyst in community development. I'm working as the TSP project manager, but working very closely with Steve and our city engineer, Mike McCarthy. We really are sharing the duties on the project. So over the last several months, we've been hard at work building the key TSP policies, the financially constrained project list, which I will explain in a little more detail later in this presentation. And we also just concluded our third phase of public engagement, and so we have some interesting feedback from that. Quick agenda review. Start with the recap of summer engagement results. Then we have a refresher on the TSP goals, which will key up our review of the TSP policies, because those two pieces are really now very much aligned. And we have a quick recap of our prioritization framework process, and then an overview of the draft constrained project list and how that was developed. And finally, Steve and I will discuss the next steps in the adoption schedule for the plan. So we kicked off our third phase of public engagement in early July. And this is an overview of the results from that engagement. Our consultants organized a series of focus groups, and we've had approximately 55 attendees at those events. We also put a lot of effort into publicizing our TSP survey. I'm sure you've seen the signs around town. We did many social media posts, email blasts, and tried to get the word out through partners and any individuals who we work with closely. And through that effort, we had 913 website visitors, 269 individual survey responses, and 919 interactive map contributions. We were particularly happy with the number of physical survey submissions we received at the community events that we were attending throughout the summer. And speaking of that, so as I mentioned, the process opened July 12th. The survey was open through August 19th. We held a community workshop on August 8th. Then we had staff and consultants in attendance at three key events. We were at Viva Tualatin. We had a fun prize wheel there where we were letting people spin the prize wheel if they completed the survey. And so we had city branded items or vouchers for the food trucks that were there. So people were really excited about participating in that. We held an ice cream social at Jurgens Park. We were luring people out to talk to us with ice cream, and that worked pretty well. And then we were at the music in the park at Quality Park. And at that event, any concert goer who took the survey received a voucher for a snow cone at one of the neighboring booths. And we got a pretty good youth response from that effort. And then our consultants focused on these three focus groups here. We had Spanish language, BIPOC transit riders, and cyclist focus groups.
Also, just to add quickly, we didn't have it on this slide, but we also stood up a really fun engagement event with some of the Team Tualatin volunteers, so like middle schoolers and high schoolers. And we got them in this room actually and fed them donuts and juice and gave them a sugar rush and had them fill out some surveys and got some feedback from them as well. So it was cool to get the youth perspective on top of all of these engagement efforts.
Definitely. And they were surprisingly engaged, asked really good questions, and participated much more enthusiastically than I was even estimating they would, but that was a great effort. Here's just some demographic breakdowns of people who submitted survey responses. The majority of respondents were Tualatin residents, but we also had some workers, businesses, business owners, students, and visitors, and a few others. A decent percent of the respondents identified as a person of color. We also collected some data on income and disabilities, and these are just some highlights. There will be more details in the public engagement summary memo that our consultants, Alta Planning and Design, are putting together for us. So that'll be an interesting review of all of the granular details that went into this phase of public engagement.
And just a quick note on that, if I remember correctly, specifically the non-white engagement was roughly proportional to the actual non-white population in Tualatin, which is often very hard when we do engagement. So I think that was a particular success.
Yeah, indeed. A key focus of the survey was asking for feedback on some big idea projects that came up during early public engagement phases and discussions with our community advisory committee and conversations with staff. And so here's a list of how all of the big idea projects kind of landed on the ratings that we received from the surveys. They all scored relatively well, but as you can see, there's a bit of a gap between the projects on the bottom of the list and the top of the list. So up top there, we have a bike ped bridge crossing the river at 65th Avenue. Coming in at number 1, just below that, a big project that would grade separate Tualatin Sherwood Road from the railroad tracks, and also that would include some work on Boone's Ferry. We have a bike ped bridge over the Tualatin Sherwood Road. Some vague ideas on locations, but not exactly sure where we would put that yet. And then the construction of a Sagert Street Bridge pedestrian facility. Those were kind of our highest ranking there in the top 4 spots. And then at the bottom, the projects that people were a little less excited about, we had the Basalt Creek I-5 overpass and new West Station in the Basalt Creek area. But like I mentioned, all of these scored relatively well and relatively close to each other. And then a big general question on the survey about the proposed projects, and that question was, do these projects help achieve a vision for a balanced transportation system in Tualatin? Overwhelmingly, respondents voted that either yes or mostly yes, that is correct. The no votes expressed some concern regarding project costs, a little too much emphasis on bike projects maybe, and some concern about not addressing congestion, but overall positive response there. So that was our public engagement phase for the summer. Pivot over to goals here. So just to provide a quick refresher, and I know you've seen the goals earlier this year. We began to develop the goals with a review of the existing goals in our TSP, which is as currently adopted. We also reviewed some related planning efforts such as the climate action plan and the comprehensive plan. And then we held some internal workshops to get staff input, and we brought that initial work to council for feedback last August. And finally, we relied on community participation through online survey and open house and focus groups to fine tune those draft goals. And those were 2 of the early phases of public engagement back last year. Ultimately, we landed on the following 5 goals for the TSP: advance our land use vision, provide a high quality of life, expand opportunities for safe multimodal transportation, advance climate and health goals, and invest wisely. So the goals serve as a foundational piece of all aspects of the plan. But as we looked at the existing TSP policies, the goals became a guide for how we ultimately decided to structure the revised TSP policies, which can then be used as a guide for city decision-making going forward. The policy review and revision was really important for this TSP update because we needed to reflect new statewide legislation as well as changing community priorities in this plan. And there is a notable difference between the existing policies and the revised policies. And that is, in the previous TSP, all of the policies were organized based on mode. So we had roadway policies, transit policies, bike policies, pedestrian policies, things like that. We are now organizing those policies under each of the TSP goals that I just mentioned on that last slide. And I want to thank Aaron Eggman for doing the heavy lifting on getting those all dialed in and reviewing the old goals, looking at new state requirements and putting this new set of goals together that align with the TSP, or the priorities that align with the TSP goals.
If I could just interject here. So the draft policies are in the packet that you received. We're providing them for you on an informational basis. If you have feedback, we're certainly happy to take it and would welcome it. But the intention, I think, of the overall presentation is just to kind of inform you as we're going along with this. So it doesn't feel like when we get to the end of the road and you're asked to make a recommendation to council that's like, you hopefully feel familiar with this information and these topics and so forth. So that's just a little bit of framing of the intent of this presentation and what we're looking for from you this evening.
That's right. And if you do have any feedback, we're kind of looking for answers to these specific questions. Do these policies advance the city's goals for transportation? And is there anything missing? Is there anything that we just didn't capture in this set of policies? We did receive some feedback from our community advisory committee when we met with them last week, and we're working through how to best incorporate that feedback. So there may be some small tweaks, but we don't anticipate any major overhaul of the policies as they exist in your packet. So let's shift gears and take a look at the draft constrained project list, but first, just a recap of the TSP process. So the development of the initial draft list of projects relied on a review of a lot of different documents and sources, as you can see in the gray box here. So we looked at network gaps. We asked the community their desires and their concerns. We looked at projects from other city adopted plans, and those all came together, and those ideas were compiled into a large unprioritized list of potential projects. And so that's kind of the first green box you see there. Those projects were then evaluated based on transportation priorities, and we considered the TSP goals, community feedback, and feedback from partner agencies, et cetera, to develop a prioritization framework. And we're now at the point where we have a list of prioritized projects that will be analyzed based on funding constraints. So essentially, how much revenue do we think we have to complete these projects over the next 20 years, which is the window for this plan. And at the end of all this work, we will have a prioritized project list that is financially constrained. So what is a financially constrained project list? So here's a few key details that are important to know. The constrained list is financially constrained to 125% of expected transportation revenue over the next 20 years. So this is a process that follows statewide planning rules for TSPs. And if we added up all of our projected revenue and essentially multiplied that by 125%, that would kind of give us our maximum threshold. And that is in alignment with those planning rules. The constrained list identifies a more feasible list of projects that can be built and that have the highest priority for the community, rather than just dumping every single project that came up onto a project list in the TSP, which is essentially how it was done in the past. So those new state requirements really emphasize that we should focus in on a set of priorities that we think we can afford over the next 20 years. And our goal is to build a balanced list that covers a range of modes, geographic areas, costs, and timelines. And this will allow us to take advantage of various funding opportunities. It's important to note that just because a project is on the constrained list, that does not guarantee it will be built. And it doesn't necessarily mean that there is funding dedicated for that project. But it is a way that we can kind of create a prioritized chunk of projects that we think we can do. And also it's important to note that the projects don't have to be built in a specific order. So if we have a really complex, high cost, high priority project at the very top of the list, that doesn't mean we can't build a lower cost, lower priority project before that as we work out the details for that big, expensive project. And projects that don't make the financially constrained list can still be built. We can ask developers to build projects that don't make the financially constrained list. And we will include all those projects on the financially unconstrained list in the TSP. And that's essentially sort of our aspirational list. So anything that doesn't make the cut for that financially constrained list, it'll still be in the TSP. And just kind of an overview on how this was developed. So we put together a huge list of projects. We did some project refinement just to make sure that everything was captured accurately there. We scored all of the projects based on our prioritization framework. We did a little bit of refinement to some of those scores based on feedback that we heard from our community advisory committee and just taking a second look at the list with our consultants. The consultants put together a high-level cost estimates for all of the projects, and they are developing a projected revenue for transportation capital projects, which we're still kind of waiting for that final projected revenue outlook. And then when we put all together, we'll match that with the top projects so that the projected revenue to build projects will align with the next 20 years and the projects that we kind of put above that line on the financially constrained list. So that was the process for creating that. And that whole list, I believe, is in your packet. It's quite long, but if you're interested in perusing that and you have any questions or concerns, happy to hear about those. And so those were the key milestones that we've reached over the last month. Steve, did you want to take it going
Yeah.
forward to kind of walk through the adoption?
So
schedule?
yeah, this is the draft project timeline or the adoption schedule. So kind of some of the upcoming milestones we have is this Monday, the 23rd, we have a city council work session where Cody and I and Mike are going to make a somewhat similar but expanded presentation to the city council, updating them on the TSP work. In early October on the 9th, we will reconvene the Community Advisory Committee for a final meeting to get a recommendation that then will either have multiple members or a representative of the CAC coming to Planning Commission ultimately to make a recommendation to Planning Commission, who would then make a recommendation to Council. That part where the Planning Commission consideration of the CAC recommendation won't happen until early 2025 because we have, as shown there, we have a bunch of background work to do. We have gotten the Community Advisory Committee to look at the nuts and bolts of the actual TSP, the constrained project list, the policies, the goals, so on and so forth. But now we have this kind of other work that includes technical things like modeling traffic flows, finalizing the fiscal projections, and then actually just simply like building a document that's nice to look at and nice to read. So we'll have some time working with that. So ultimately what you will see is the Planning Commission will be a draft like adoption ready document as opposed to these kind of pieces that we've pulled out for your consideration. And so then again, that would occur in roughly January 2025. And then your chair would then present the Planning Commission recommendation at a city council meeting tentatively in February. And so that's kind of the steps of the timeline. And then the next slide we have is just the immediate next steps, some of which I've already kind of mentioned, the October 9th CAC meeting, and then working on the financial summary, and then ultimately the draft report. So that'll be an opportunity for the Planning Commission, and then of course, members of the general public to sit with and get a chance to review the report in total and consider it and comment as appropriate, and then ultimately recommendation. And so that concludes our presentation. Were there any questions on any of the materials we presented or anything else that you have about the TSP process overall?
So the big list, is that all the projects being considered, or is that just the ones that looked at and then you took from that list? That was in our packet. There's like the really long list of projects in there that you were talking about
I believe that is all of the list.
that are being considered, and then there'll be like priorities chosen from there. Is that correct?
So what was in your packet was the draft constrained project list. I think that ultimately the last page, if I remember correctly, is, and then the last page is the unconstrained.
Oh, okay. So there
Okay.
was a page of,
Yeah, the
Okay.
page, so like the example is like which scored highly, from community feedback, but like the I-5 northbound 205 braided ramps. And so the idea of that project is like if you're coming to I-5 from 205 southbound and you're going to I-5 northbound, that you would be able to kind of like essentially go over the Nyberg off ramp so that there wouldn't be that continued like merge conflict that happens that I'm sure you've all experienced before. And so that was a project that ODOT is supported, and they've asked us to add it to our TSP because that's partly how it gets done. But obviously, like we don't have the financial resources within our 125% 20-year projection to accomplish a project like that.
Okay, that was one of my next questions, but some of those aren't like city specific. They were
Right,
like county
exactly.
roads or ODOT roads and stuff. So you put it in there in hopes that it helps push the project along.
Exactly. Yeah, because that's, I mean, that's a key, like that's the first question in like applications for like federal funding or whatever is like, does the local jurisdiction support it? Is it in their adopted TSP? And so we have to answer yes to those questions, otherwise we're sunk. Was there a question in there though about prioritization?
Yeah, so so that is that list in a priority listing? Like is the highest, or was it?
In this draft iteration, it is. I
Okay,
think it was basically just intended to daylight kind of to show what it was scored based on rankings, because Cody mentioned the kind of like process where it was essentially filtered by goals. And so projects that met of those 5 TSP goals, projects that met all of them fared better than projects that didn't. But again, like in our final adopted TSP, we're not anticipating ranking them. It was more just to show folks along the way how that panned out. Because as Cody pointed out, like, and this has happened with our existing TSP, is that like funding opportunities aren't like necessarily orderly. And so we might have, you know, like a grant for a project, like a great example, and I don't know where it's scored on it, but there's like the don't think it's scored like super duper great is like there's the Sager Trail extension. Um the Sager Street, no, Sager Street Bikeway. There's like a trail that was identified in the Parks Master Plan that we're then putting in the TSP, but it seems like that's probably going to be funded through the park bond. And so even though it didn't score highly on this, it's going to get built quicker than potentially other projects for that reason. So that's just an example, like kind of a micro example of how it would work in the future.
right, there was a few, like some of the bus stuff had already, like the route to Oregon City and stuff, like it's already up and running and stuff. So some of it's already being done, even though it has been on there.
Exactly.
Right.
And
Yeah.
another example, and so a lot of these kind of bigger projects like are gonna, a first step is study them. And so the 65th Borland and Sager intersection, uh, that project is already like money is already being allocated to start to study potential designs to improve that intersection, like interchange kind of area.
That's great. That's one of
But
the
it's
questions I had.
on the
Yeah.
it's on the project list because we want to make sure that it's on it, but like we're not necessarily waiting for the TSP to be adopted to move forward with that project.
I think you'll also notice that the major Herman Road project here, which the city was awarded MSTIP funding from the county for, I think it's sitting on the unconstrained list right now, which that's a project that we know has funding and is moving forward as soon as planning and design is completed. So
I had a couple questions about the survey, which may be rookie questions, and if they are, just tell me.
Sure.
The big ideas in the survey process were respondents asked to rank those. Obviously, you look at that list and they're all pretty good ideas.
Yep.
Were people asked to pick, say, 3 or 4 or 5 that they thought were most important?
We asked everyone to rank the entire list on a score of between 0 to 5, basically. And we did have to give advice at some junctures that please don't just give every project a 5, because we actually want to know what are the priorities of the community. But I think some may have done that anyways.
And just out of curiosity, were the focus groups professionally facilitated?
Yeah, we have a sub-consultant under our primary consultant that specializes in facilitating focus groups.
Especially like the Spanish language ones in particular. And then we had like one of the project consultants, for example, Alta Planning and Design, that kind of specializes in multimodal like bike and pedestrian. They facilitated the cycling, the cyclist focus group. And then the youth one we did as staff. So whether or not you call it professional is debatable, perhaps, but
Any other questions for staff?
I guess maybe a couple more, just more informational is all it is. Like there was some bicycle traffic calming, I'm trying to remember that I read on the list. What does that consist of? Like, is that bulb outs or what kind of a project is that?
I mean, a lot of the like, I think what is called traffic calming in a lot of cases is just simply signage to like let people know that these are already like mellow routes for cycling. Our consultant, Alta, because it's kind of their specialty, like did an analysis of like particularly low traffic streets. And so part of the intent, which is a new thing for us based on some of those new standards, and that's like um the piece here where we talk about the like this MMLOS, which stands for multimodal level of service, and it's a new concept that was I think it maybe existed last time we did the TSP, but it's like part of the actual TSP process now. And so that's what they did was they looked at like like more mellow streets that could potentially be turned into bikeways. And so some of it could be just simply signage. Thing it's that it could be also is it could be like sharrows, like painted arrows on the road to like identify to drivers that it's a shared on-street facility and that there's not a separate bike lane to kind of get people to understand that. I mean, and it can be in some cases for pedestrians, like you said, bulb outs to like make the distance between a crosswalk shorter, or other kinds of things there. I mean, I think that there are probably other tools in the toolbox that I'm not thinking of, but those are a few that come to mind that we've specifically talked about.
Okay, and then I saw on there like adaptive signal stuff, like you were gonna do some adaptive, like I don't know, smart signals or something on some of the light signals. I was just curious what that meant exactly, I guess. Is that just like, is it better cameras or?
Yeah, some of it I know, and this is like feedback that we've gotten throughout the process is just better like better alignment between signal timing. Like I'm sure you've experienced the like thing where you just like get a green and then hit a red.
Okay, I just liked the thought of that. That sounded like a great project, so, yeah. Okay, and then it looked like one of the projects was potentially widening our section or a little bit of our section of Tualatin Sherwood Road, since Sherwood's doing like, there's that big, we're expanding further down to Sherwood. It looked like there was the extension of that towards us. Is that correct? Is that what I saw in there? Or something like that. It was like a short segment.
County will be working on the bulk of Tualatin Sherwood Road. I think it's going to come into the city.
Okay,
Off the top of my head, I can't remember how far, but I want to say quite a ways into the city.
I don't think so. I think there are a couple of different projects. I think that
maybe I just saw one that looked like it.
I think that the most of them have focused that we have in there focused on the Boone's Ferry Tualatin Sherwood Road.
Okay, at that intersection.
Yeah.
Okay,
So that's like, I mean, it's a variety of different things.
like the railroad crossing and,
Yeah.
okay.
Railroad crossing or just like improving like signal timing, turn lanes, various things. And ultimately, I think it's gonna have to just be a study to try to figure out some new solutions.
Any other questions? Thank you, Cody.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Welcome.
Have a great evening.
Will do.
Thank you.
All right, Steve, I'm guessing this next one is yours.
It is.
Staff will provide a brief legal training to outline the planning commission's role and responsibilities.
Yeah. I'll try to keep it. We did this approximately a year ago previously. And so I tried to tighten it up a little bit, make it a little bit shorter and keep it high level. And then if we have questions, we can expand from there.
Great.
I think, part of the subtext of this is knowing that the planning commission will have a piece of the LAM expansion application, the industrial master plan update. You've heard a industrial master plan update previously.
Yeah. I saw the signs, I went to the website, I'm like, oh, this is gonna come to us. I'm not gonna look at this.
So So some of this is just kind of a refresher, and then I've tried to include a little bit of like just kind of specific tips in regards to like deciding an application, because usually the planning commission primarily meets in its like consideration and recommendation duties, but this will actually be a rare example where you'll be a decision maker, and so there's some more unique things that perhaps I've not focused on as much in the past that I will this time. So, for those of you who've seen this before, it's this kind of same as last year. I think the key thing is that like, like you were saying, Bill, like, kind of knowing that you shouldn't be doing something. And then if you're not sure if you should be doing something, asking a question is really the goal, not expecting or hoping that you fill up precious brain space by memorizing all of this information. It's more so like, I think I heard something about that. I'm going to ask a question is really what we want from you. And so we'll talk tonight about planning commission authority generally, kind of some information about public meetings at the high level, and then land use hearings, roles, criteria, evidence, and the final decision. So this is, I think, a good recap is that you only function as a body. So you don't have like individual power as a planning commissioner. Your decision-making power is limited to the group. And so you are expected to like support the planning commission decision, whether you voted for it or not, at least respect the decision, even if you disagreed with it. And again, if you're going to express personal opinions or comments, they should be expressed only if you're making it clear that you're acting in your individual capacity and not representing the city. You're also, and I didn't include this in this presentation, you're going to get an email from our city attorney that has a little bit of an additional twist on that, that as commissioners, as like appointed board members, you have some additional limitations on like political campaigning from your seat on the commission. There will be more detail, but the long and the short of it is that you're forbidden from like expressing like support of a political campaign or political like candidate from as a planning commissioner. You can certainly do it in your own private life outside of planning commission, but which is different from like a city council where they do have some limited ability to like support a candidate or like even a measure. So, using your position as a planning commissioner to say like, I'm in support of this parks bond or something like that. You should only do that as an individual and not from the dais. More detail to come, but just giving you a heads up. So generally open public meetings, it's governed under Oregon revised statutes. The key thing here is you have to meet in public. You can't make decisions behind closed doors in smoky bars or other smoke-filled rooms without the public having an opportunity to sit in and view what's being considered. So kind of it says it all there. It needs to be open and available for the public to attend. And so a quorum may not meet in private. There's some exceptions to that, like you all could go to a training together, and I'll talk a little bit about that. You all could go to a social gathering together as long as you don't try to conduct planning commission business, that's okay. So those are things just to be aware of under the open and public meetings law. So again, no private meetings. So I'm not going to go through all this, but I mean, I think that the point is that like, best case, you don't meet as a quorum elsewhere, but otherwise that you just want to keep it to social topics and not things that the planning commission might be asked to consider. And I think just bear in mind under the municipal code, the planning commission like is asked to consider a wide variety of things affecting the city. So it's pretty comprehensive. So just kind of keep that in mind. Serial,
Ask a question.
of course.
So what would this situation be if I mentioned something to the mayor at a Tualatin budget committee meeting?
Yeah, that's kind of different because that's like you're not meeting as a quorum.
Huh.
And this actually goes into this serial meetings thing. So even if you're not a quorum, if people communicate through to each other, it ends up being a quorum. So if you communicate to the mayor and the mayor communicates to another person and then communicates to say the budget committee quorum might be 4 people or whatever it is, then you could have a serial meeting having taken place. And
Got it.
so generally speaking, I mean, I think that like if you know that it's something that's not the mayor's not going to discuss with someone else, then that's easy, right? But I think if it's something that they could, then you'd probably want to not do that. It more so like serial meetings more so happen in it when it like email communication. It's like orally, it's much harder for it to happen. It happens a lot less. I think that, you know, it used to happen maybe like where people might call, you know, back in the day before email, people would call each other and like say, so and so said this, so and so said that, and you'd have like a serial meeting. That, but contemporarily, it more so comes up via email. It could also, I guess, technically come up if like one commissioner, like, which again would be discouraged, but if a commissioner like posted about something on social media and then a group of commissioners commented and weighed in and there was a quorum, you could have some sort of serial meeting accidentally there. Pretty unlikely, but just something to be aware of. So best practices is that, you know, if Lindsay is sending out emails, refrain from using reply all. Obviously, like if it's something like just confirming that we're a quorum and things like that, don't worry. But if like if a commissioner like, or if staff says something about the topic that we're meeting on, try to like keep it just kind of very nuts and bolts and don't talk about the actual content. So I mentioned the social media aspect of it. And then similarly, although you can certainly talk to staff, you can't use staff as kind of like an intermediary because normally talking to staff is not considered like an ex parte outside of a hearing process communication, but we can't like relay on information to someone else. And so that should all be in the public meeting. That's the key takeaway, is just that it, like the intent is just that it should be daylit and that it shouldn't be happening like without the ability for the public to attend the meeting. And then social gatherings I alluded to, but yes, you can meet in social settings, must be purely social. Don't talk about official business. You know, and if it does, then like try to turn it away from it or leave the social gathering. And then if you're going to attend a conference or training, so I've sent some, if you like 4 of you end up going to that, it's like excluded from the definition of meeting. You know, I think that because there could be opportunities for you to like talk about something that you've decided in the past in a training, like I have a question about this, and then, you know, everyone's hearing about it. So I think still in that context, I would try to avoid talking in a public setting with other commissioners about future business, but that would be exempt normally. The one other point that I did want to actually make about that I didn't talk about earlier is just that it's just the quorum function of the public meeting. So we do need a quorum just simply to have planning commission. So in the event that only 3 of you show up, we just don't have a meeting, we go home. Even I think previously we had been under the impression that if we didn't like do any actual official business, that we could do that, but we spoke to the city attorney at one point to confirm that, and he said that as a public body, like you have to have a quorum just simply to have the meeting. And so if we don't for whatever reason, then even if we're just having a work session or discussion only topics, we still have to just cancel the meeting and reschedule. So just be aware of that. So when we ask you to show up and you said you already did, please let us know if for some reason you're not. And then of course we have the Zoom option now, which we didn't used to have.
And I know we can delay a little bit. We did that a couple of months ago.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's another good point, that we can sit, and if somebody's like stuck in traffic and is, you know, or just said, I have to show up late, then we can hang out and not start the meeting until they get here. So great point. Thank you. So as planning commission, you're the only board or commission for the city that has these dual roles of both a recommender and a decision maker. And so recommender, which is you make recommendations and suggestions to the council regarding, like I said, this is a very broad swath of things: preparation and revisions of plans for the growth, development, and beautification of areas both inside the city limits and then within our urban planning area. And then a bunch of other stuff, which I've truncated for brevity. But I mean, you get the idea. It's pretty broad. So if you're talking shop outside of our public meetings, you probably shouldn't, because you probably are talking about things that are within your purview. And then quasi judicial, so that's one where you're actually as a body sitting as a judge and you're considering a application request by applying evidence to pre-existing criteria in our development code and or comprehensive plan to a decision. And so that can include also state law, city code in some cases, and then metro code. And then the key for the quasi judicial is that it typically only affects one or a small group, and you must reach a decision within 120 days. And so for the planning commission's purpose, that's conditional use permits, variances, and industrial master plans. There are other quasi judicial applications like quasi judicial plan map amendment that come through planning commission, but in that application, you're just a recommender, and then council is the decision maker on that application. And so there's a little bit of a distinction there. Recommendation. So, I mean, it's really, technically it's conducted like a public meeting, although just for ease and I think, procedural correctness, we at the planning commission hold it fairly similar to a legislative hearing. And so it's a public meeting with fewer procedural requirements than the quasi judicial meeting. We don't have to give the explanation of the process and criteria, but they're in the staff report anyway. Disclosures are not required or encouraged because you're not making a decision and it's not quasi judicial. It's still, I think, a good idea anyway. And then you don't have to accept public testimony, but as a practice, we historically have, and I think it's a good one. And then similarly, if you're making a decision, it's a good idea to have deliberations on the decision prior to voting. It's not necessarily as strict. And then of course, we still have a staff report with findings. And so that's effectively incorporated into the record by reference. And so you don't necessarily have to for these recommendation decisions, but if you have specific reasons for making your recommendation, it's certainly welcome and encouraged to put that on the record. And then written decision on recommendations not required. So our current custom is for bill or a designee to go to the city council to orally present the planning commission's recommendation to council. But unlike a quasi judicial decision, it doesn't need to be distilled into a written decision or recommendation. It's not required. And so in the event that no one can make it, we can also just simply include the recommendation in the record. It's not required to occur in any particular form. Quasi judicial, again, there's specific procedures that are required to be implemented. They are due process to protect the rights of everyone involved, all parties, including people commenting even against the application. And so you read a script, the chair typically, which explains the process and criteria for the decision making. You do have to, all of the planning commissioners make disclosures if you have any of these three things. And I'll talk about them in a subsequent slide at a high level, just so you know what they are. Ex parte communications, bias, and conflicts of interest. And then you have to actually hold the public hearing and offer the public the opportunity to submit evidence, both written and oral. And then the applicant generally gets the opportunity to rebut anything that's submitted by someone who's not the applicant. And then at the conclusion of the hearing, you must close the public testimony portion and then deliberate solely based on the record and then reach a vote. And then that decision has to be distilled into a final written decision with specific findings related to the applicable criteria. And so we'll either bring that draft final order with findings as part of the hearing, or we'll bring it back at a subsequent hearing if there's additional findings that are added to the record. And so we help with all of that. And of course, we are here to serve as a resource. So if you have questions as they go along, like if you're conducting a hearing, and certainly if there's a bill's very good at doing this. He's very experienced and has done it a number of times now, so he doesn't need a lot of help. But if you all have questions, certainly we're here to act as a resource to help you all. And so I'll talk about the ex parte communications, conflicts, and bias just quickly. Ex parte communications are the most likely to occur. So it's any communication, written or oral, electronic, visual, like the decision maker sees it, it's made to the decision maker, and it's concerning the subject matter of the quasi-judicial hearing. And it occurs while the matter is pending. So it's after the application is filed, before the final decision. If you're finding out stuff before the application is filed, that's okay. In the case of the Lamb case, the application is filed, so not finding out stuff on your own is excellent. Good practice. You got it right. And then of course, like the thing is that you can just simply, the way to cure that situation is just simply to like note that like you initially visited the site and then you discontinued your visit as soon as you realized that it was related to this case, and that you don't think that that's going to bias your like decision-making process or affect it in any way. So that's like how you get out of, that's how you cure that process, is basically just explaining what your contact was. So if your neighbor approaches you at the supermarket and says, I want to talk about Lamb, and they say a whole bunch of stuff before you can stop them and say, I'm on the planning commission, I can't talk about it. All you have to do is just say, I had this conversation and this was what was discussed, and then you're good to go. Bias is a little bit harder if you have it, and it's where you're not able to make an impartial decision. And so, you know, if you have like personal prejudice against it, like let's say that, you know, the applicant is an employer that you were fired from before, and you just have it out for them, and you just think, I don't care, I cannot make a partial decision against them. And so that in that situation, the cure for that, if that's actually happening, would be to not participate in the hearing and step away from the dais to show that you're not part of the hearing. But like, even if there's the appearance of bias, like, oh, you know, like you work for that company or something and they're an applicant, you would need to actually like, or that's not a good example because that speaks to the next one, but you were fired from them, but you've never said like that you have anything against them. You'd need some specific evidence or statements to say that, you know, you're biased. And so if you were fired by the company and they come to you with an application and you just say, you just kind of note it quickly and say, I don't have any issue making an impartial decision, like I understand why I was fired, that's okay, it's water under the bridge, then you can proceed with being a decision maker on that particular item. Conflict of interest is a little bit, which I was kind of getting into at first before I pulled myself back. That's where you actually have like financial interest in the outcome of the application potentially. And that includes you, your relatives, or like business associates. And so there can either be two forms, actual conflict or potential conflict. Actual is when you just like specifically could get an actual benefit from it, like the, you know, approval of a land use application would actually financially benefit you directly. That's an actual conflict of interest. Potential is like, it's kind of tenuous, like it's not certain to occur. And the actual, like you just couldn't, you wouldn't be able to participate. It wouldn't, you'd have to step down from the dais. And so I had one of those before where a city councilor was a supplier to a business that was looking to be approved for a development. And so they were actually going to benefit financially from approval of the application. Conversely, I had an architectural review board member who worked for a geotechnical company that would frequently support applications that came before the ARB, but this person worked as an office staff on the front end. They weren't a geotechnical engineer. They weren't engaged in like the process of conducting the reports. And so their conflict of interest was potential, but they basically disclaimed it and said, I don't have any like actual benefit from this, from the, like they, you know, the company gets paid for the geotechnical report either way, so they don't have any actual stake in the outcome of the application. But just to be safe, they put it on the record each time an application came before them that had their company or a competitor geotechnical company as part of the record. Any questions so far on these?
These are probably corner case stuff, but maybe for that last example, could something like that be grounds for like a denied applicant to appeal to a higher approval authority?
I mean, it could be, and so they would have to raise it in the hearing.
Okay. So they have standing.
So yeah, they would have, and so like typically if someone like an applicant or someone in the audience wants to challenge any of these things, then they would wait until the public testimony portion or the applicant testimony portion of the conduct of the hearing. And then they would say, I think you should recuse yourself from this decision because I think that you like are biased. I think you do have an actual conflict, or I think that your ex parte communications have like, kind of poisoned the well, as it were.
Okay.
And so that can happen. And that actually almost happened with our ARB, where one of our ARB members owned property next door to a property that was under consideration. And so the applicant was kind of like, well, should you participate? And the ARB member said, I don't have any problem approving the application, like on the merits. Like it doesn't, I mean, I guess it could affect the person, but there's no direct impact to them financially from approval of that development. So it went forward. So it would be incumbent on someone to raise it.
Okay. Thanks, Steve.
Yeah. And then public meetings, just a quick recap there. And this kind of gets to like disruptive public meetings, I guess is maybe what the heading should say. So the public has a right to attend and observe. If it's generally a public meeting and not a hearing, you don't have to let them participate. I know you have historically, but you can not let the public participate. And particularly like you can establish time limits on the public comment, but you can't like apply it unequally. So if you give one person 3 minutes, you have to give everyone 3 minutes. And then you cannot remove a member of the public from a meeting unless you can clearly demonstrate that the person is disrupting the meeting that precludes you from conducting business. So if they're like shouting or whatever, then you can remove them. But, or I know we've had it happen in the past where people are like, booing or cheering. It's certainly reasonable of the chair to say like, please, withhold reactions to people's testimony and let's just consider let people testify without interruption. I think that's fair game because you're not removing people, you're just saying, sure, you're kind of laying out some ground rules. So that's also something to bear in mind. And then, as planning commissioners, what's your role overall? So I think that, try to understand land use planning. Obviously, no one is experts. It's continuing to evolve. We attend continuing education several times a year, every year. And even then, we're not on top of it as staff, but we do our best to do that, to be a resource to you. Your role also is to reflect the values of the community. So, you're the eyes and ears of the community. You're representing other folks. So that's a real value add of your position. Educate the public on land use. So obviously there are certain situations where the planning commission has in the past and will in the future, I expect, educate the public on what their role is and how the land use process works. And certainly having it come from you all as community members and as appointed board members carries a lot of weight with the public. So it's always appreciated by staff when you tell people history about things or kind of explain processes to folks. And so that's a real value add. And then, understanding the opportunities and limits. So, you can recommend to council new or change policies, but then there are certain limits of what you can do. Obviously in the advisory role, the council doesn't have to take your recommendation as a body. They can go in an opposite direction. They can zig where you zagged. And so just kind of be aware of that. And, as you interpret and apply the development code, you're applying facts to criteria. So just kind of keep that in mind. We're here to help assist you and act as a resource. And then in the decision-making recommendations, and this all comes from best practices given to us by the state. So I didn't necessarily invent this on my own. But I mean, the recommendation is to some decision making does require you to be courageous and make a recommendation or make a decision based on criteria or based on like facts that you are able to, parse from the record, that isn't always necessarily popular, right? Like it's not a land use isn't a voting contest. It's not, the most people think something doesn't make it so. And so that can result in you having to make hard decisions. And so we recognize that and appreciate that that sometimes is your role. So this table just kind of explains a little bit about what staff role is versus how planning commission, is impacted by those things. So we kind of explain land use and the ground rules. We also like accept and reject applications. So we had a CIO meeting before this where I talked about this topic in kind of greater detail, but like we really work with applicants from the pre-application conference stage, even before the pre-application conference stage, to ensure that an application meets the criteria before it moves forward. Sometimes applicant will proceed regardless, but generally speaking, they do take that under advisement. And so when you're getting an application, it's usually been very thoroughly vetted. And so it can conversely sometimes feel like all you are presented with is opportunity to approve things, and it's like feels like a rubber stamp. And the reason for that is that there's a lot of like careful planning and iteration that goes into an application before you see it that makes it in a status that is intended to be approvable. And then we handle administrative stuff. Lindsay, as our office coordinator, assists us quite heavily with the handling public notice and other administration. This is kind of the dotting of the I's and crossing of the T's, helping making sure that your decision making or recommendations doesn't get appealed on a technical basis, and kind of ensures that there's, I think, sanctity, or like your decision makings and recommendations are held in high esteem. And then, we stay up on, we do legal specific training every year in December with the Oregon chapter of the American Planning Association. And then we do other various things, like we have our annual Oregon planning meeting coming up in October that also usually has some element of additional legal training, and then that helps us be able to advise you as best as we can. And then we also have the city attorney as a resource, that if there's a particularly thorny question, we can turn to them to assist you. So decision-making criteria, I think I've already alluded to this a little bit, but I do want to go over this one a little bit greater detail, just because this like specifically speaks to the Lamb case. I included a little example there of how industrial master plan works. But so reiterating that this is the application of pre-existing criteria. So what's in the development code already, not what you wish was in there or what you think should be in there, to a set of facts. And the facts is the record, right? Like, and so it's not things outside the record that you think you know about Lamb, or that you know about Lamb that your cousin that works there told you. It's what's in the record. And so if the applicant demonstrates compliance with the pre-existing criteria based on the evidence that they have submitted into the record, unless there has been contradictory evidence submitted by someone else that is, the legal standard is called preponderance, but it's basically more convincing evidence than the evidence submitted by the applicant. If the applicant's evidence is more convincing, or is the only evidence, then the application must be approved. Even again, if you disagree with the criteria, or you think that there are different criteria should be applied, or you think that you know something that's not in the record that wasn't included. If it's not in the record, you can't use it to be a basis for your decision making. And so looking at the industrial master plans, it's a pretty limited criteria for approval. So it's public facilities will be adequate at or before occupancy. So, I mean, there'll be consideration of the traffic report, but the adequacy standard is, basically a level of service standard. It's just ensuring that the level of service standard that's in the code is met. It's not like a subjective criteria, it's a objective criteria. A little bit more subjective is location, design, size of materials of structures. And so that structures on the site is compatible with other nearby developments. And so that is, especially thinking of like the Lamb Industrial Master Plan, where the buildings are more so oriented towards away from the residential areas and more towards the other industrial properties. It's more so considering their location relative to those other developments, maybe not as much the residential, I would think, based on my reading of that criteria. And then internal circulation, again, internal circulation setbacks, et cetera, are consistent with the zoning. And so that's again kind of internally focused on the site. The industrial master plan process is specifically designed to give applicants an opportunity to modify criteria like setbacks or building height without going through a variance. And so that is something that the planning commission does have discretion over, but that's basically the criteria in a nutshell, is that it's an public facility adequacy standard. It's also known as a concurrency standard, which will be considered in greater detail in the architectural review that will accompany the application. And then the location, design, size, and material of structures is compatible, also be considered in greater detail by architectural review board, but it's certainly within your purview based on these criteria. And then this last piece is really your decision-making authority, because then the architectural review board, which will consider the application after you've made your decision, would be bound by any changes that you make to those standards through the industrial master plan. And when building G was considered, that's exactly how the process worked before, is that there was some modifications to like parking lot setbacks, for example. And then the architectural review board was bound by those modifications that the planning commission made. And then last couple of notes regarding interpretation of criteria. If the wording is clear and unambiguous, it must be followed regardless of legislative intent. So if you think that the city council changed the code to mean something, but it just says, height is X, but you think that that was intended to achieve a certain result that is not reflected in that criteria, it unfortunately does not matter and can't be considered. And then if there are two conflicting provisions, which we try to avoid, but sometimes does happen, we're not perfect, the more specific controls the general. And so that's a good one to remember. Questions on this one? It's a lot to digest, but thank you for allowing me to go a little more deeply into that one. And then findings, I'm not going to go as deep into this one because I think that you all, and I know Alan, Commissioner Perricchini, you're a little bit newer to the commission, but I think you're a little familiar with how planning works in planning commission, but staff develops the findings. And so I think that, hopefully we've been doing a good job consistently in the past of providing adequate findings that give you support for your decision-making and help you understand how the applicant's facts relate to the criteria. So that's kind of the gist of it, is that, and then conversely, if a decision is going to veer from those findings, then we would have to, as staff, work with you to help craft findings that support your decision making. So if you're going to go in a different direction and say, there's an additional criteria that applies, or we want to apply this criteria in a different way, like going back to the example, if the staff made findings on an applicant request to change that internal circulation, for example, and the planning commission wanted to make a finding that their modification wasn't appropriate and staff had made a recommendation that it was, then we would have to change our findings and put our heads together to figure out how we were supporting that finding. But that's what we can do to help you as a commission. And then evidence, just quickly here, I think I've kind of alluded to most of this already, but it is worth repeating. So the applicant does have the burden of proof. They must introduce evidence that shows that the approval criteria is satisfied. However, if they submit evidence, even if it's not like really, really compelling, but if it meets kind of the baseline, it addresses the criteria and there's no other evidence, then you kind of have to accept it as fact, unless there's some other way that we can, like some other evidence in the record that supports to a different conclusion than the applicant has made. And so the opponents conversely, have a duty to show that the applicant's facts are incorrect or that they've not introduced all the facts necessary to satisfy their burden of proof. So whoever has the, like, not necessarily the most proof, so that, you know, if there's comment in opposition that says the same thing over and over again, it's not a weighing of how many people oppose an application and have evidence against it. It's a weighing of whose evidence was better. So if it's traffic related and the applicant hires an expert traffic engineer, and then other people just have observational like anecdotes about how traffic is functioning, that can be hard to weigh in the face of an expert testimony. And so typically the best evidence for an opponent to make would be to hire their own traffic engineer to actually present evidence that refutes the evidence by the expert's traffic engineer. And that would go for any kind of like expertise-based testimony. And so the risk of making decisions without that is that LUBA can reverse the local decision or send it back to the local government to make a decision based on substantial evidence. And so again, as I said, not volume of evidence, but it's evidence that a reasonable mind could accept as adequate to support the conclusion. So if there are two equal competing pieces of evidence, two experts, and as long as a reasonable mind could accept one over the other, you don't have to accept the one that the applicant submitted just because they're the applicant. So that's the kind of flip side of the coin on that one. And so I think the last paragraph kind of just says that, but it's like if a reasonable person could find either way, then you can go in the way that you as a hearing body want to make the decision. And then conversely, if there are two people agree that there's not substantial evidence, then there's not evidence. So bear that in mind. And I think, for those of you that have gone through this before, you've experienced this, but it's just a good recap and reminder, especially as we go forward with an application that may be semi-contentious. And then final decision. So I think this is probably pretty rudimentary, but so a final decision can be approval of the application. It can be approval with additional conditions. Almost all applications have some conditions already attached to them, but in cases where there is additional conditions necessary to meet an approval criteria that the commission has before them, then conditions can be added. Or if there wasn't enough evidence to support a criteria, like, for example, landscaping standards said that, that the applicant needs to have 15% of the site landscaped. Based on the site plan that's evidence in the record, it seems clear that the applicant is capable of landscaping the site 15%, but they didn't identify how much landscaping they were providing exactly. It would be appropriate to add a condition of approval to ensure that that standard is met. And in fact, if there is a approval criteria that can be added to ensure that a standard is met that wasn't otherwise met, the commission has to apply it. You can't withhold an approval criteria where there's not enough evidence to meet something. And so if, like, for example, in the situation where, if an applicant built as much building as they wanted to on the site, and that would actually tip the traffic equation into an imbalance and you couldn't approve the application, it would be appropriate to add a condition saying that the applicant is limited to only these buildings and no more. But you can't deny it on the basis of saying that, well, they could build future buildings. You would actually have to apply a condition of approval rather than, like, you can't deny it just because something would happen without a condition of approval. I hope that's making sense. And then denial is really only where the criteria are not satisfied and there's not a condition of approval that could reasonably be attached to the situation to make it better. So the applicant's proposal just simply does generate too much traffic and it doesn't meet the standards, and the applicant is unwilling to scale back the development to an extent that would meet the standards, then you're justified in denying that application. That concludes the presentation. I hope it was a little bit shorter than last year's, but it was long, so thank you all for sitting through it. I hope that it is helpful and educational, and happy to answer questions, bounce back through any of the slides that we want to refocus on, or if not, then we can move along.
Just on the last slide, can an applicant say, planning commission approves this, conditional use permit with an, approval, an additional criteria on it? Can the applicant appeal that to council to remove that approval criteria?
They could, yeah.
Okay.
I mean, so that's a kind of funny quirk, is that approvals can be appealed. And that has happened before. I've certainly had it happen in my career where an applicant thought that the conditions being imposed were too burdensome. And they can appeal it.
Okay.
It usually doesn't work out very well for them, but it's possible, yes. Yeah. Other questions?
Thanks for the refresher, Steve.
Yeah.
It's always good to see.
You're very welcome.
That's a good segue into future action items. Will we see that industrial master plan application this year, or is it into next year?
I am not sure. It's kind of on the borderline, like it might be this year, but it might be next calendar year. Not sure for certain. So that one is potential. And then there's also down in the Norwood area, and we just got it late last week. The applicant, or I guess a new applicant effectively, has submitted a rezone application involving this roughly the same property as the previous rezone for a less dense iteration of the project. I believe it was like 90 total units rather than the 200 or 300 that were being proposed before. We don't have a planning commission or city council date set for that. That's still in our review queue at the moment to make sure it has information, but that one you actually probably will be seeing sooner rather than later.
That'll be like a plan map amendment.
It'll be a plan map amendment, and that would be a recommendation rather than a decision. But that is upcoming and on the agenda in the near future.
Yeah, I heard that we may have a tenant coming into the Hagen property.
Yeah, I think they're doing demo right now. The tenant is called Floor and Decor. It's like a kind of like a flooring, but then also other stuff. So it's kind of like imagine the like back section of Home Depot where they like have like, like kitchens and then the flooring and stuff like that, like carpet, flooring and other stuff. So it's like you can go in and see the flooring kind of like the Home Depot, and then see the like kitchens, and then get consultations and buy tile and all that other stuff. They have an outlet, I believe, in like Hayden Island is in North Portland.
Okay.
And there's a website so you can check it out to see. But that's who is identified as the tenant. So that was, if you remember, the commission made a recommendation on our like short form code update bundle that included allowing like that kind of use in the Hagen site. And so that was the intent. So it seems like it's moving forward.
Great. Okay. Anything else for future action items?
No, thank you.
Will someone move for an adjournment?
Motion to adjourn.
All right, we're adjourned. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Welcome, Alan.
Thank you.
Glad to have you here.
Oh, is there? Okay.
Oh, I just remembered I said on that, the